Okay guys, thank you very much for attending this presentation. And yeah, my name is Joseph Evans. I am the author of 2 books, City of the Falling Sky and The Trinity Awakening. And I'm also the author of 6 episode stories, those being The Phoenix Prophecy, The Ember Effect, Soulbound, The Secret of Rain, The Last Goodbye and Glitch Girl. But where probably the majority of you might know me from, my episode tutorials on YouTube. How many of you learned how to code episodes from my tutorials? Yeah, I've heard of a few times, yeah. Well, I really hope they helped you out when you were first
Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is giving you some advice, but it's not going to be technical coding advice. A little bit different to the kind of stuff I teach on YouTube. What I'm actually going to do is be teaching you how to have a good story structure, come up with a good structure for your story before you even start it, and also how you can kind of fill that with good dialogue. But before I just go into the advice, I just want to give you a brief story about my relationship with reading when I was growing up. So I don't know about you guys, but when you tell people you're a writer, they often assume that you're a bookworm and that you've been a bookworm since you were a young child. Something like this. But, this was absolutely not me at all. I was way more like this kid right here. All I wanted to do was play video games. And of course, like any parent, my mum absolutely hated me playing video games. But the games that I loved playing had really deep stories. I used to love series like the Broken Swords series, the Monkey Island series, these little point-and-click adventures. So this is what I grew up playing, which gave me my love of interactive storytelling. And the Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VII being my favourite all-time game. But of course, yeah, my mum hated the fact that I was playing these games, and she really wanted to get me reading. So she went up one day and she brought home a load of books, and she said, just try these. So I started them, read a few chapters, and I just could not get into them at all. I wasn't interested, so she went out and she got more books. And she said, just try these ones. Those obviously weren't the correct ones. I couldn't get into those, so she went out and she got more books. Now you might be thinking that this must have cost my mum a ton of money, buying all these books all the time. But it just so happens that my mum was actually also the school librarian in my school. So she had access to a lot of books. Now, here's the thing. What my mum thought that I was consuming with these video games was some kind of like vacuous, brain-dead trash. But of course, it wasn't like that at all. These video games had very, very deep stories that would play out in dialogue boxes, just like this. These are screenshots from Final Fantasy VII. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder how many words I'm actually reading on screen. And I discovered that the kind of children's classics that my mum was trying to get me to read averaged out as around about something like 50,000 words. And I had a huge, huge shock when I discovered how many words I had read in my one single playthrough of Final Fantasy VII. It was a whopping 344,000 words. So I realised something, and that was that I actually did not hate reading at all. I couldn't. I had read all those words, and I had loved every minute of it. The problem was that I just didn't find the stories in those books compelling enough. So, my mum, being the legend that she is, still didn't give up on me, and she went out and she brought this back for me one day. And now this caught my interest, because it looked like the video games I was playing. So I thought, okay, I'll give this one a shot. Read the first chapter, lo and behold, I was hooked. And the second book in this series was the first book I ever spent my own pocket money on. I ended up going on to buy the entire 9-book series, and I just remember the kind of feeling that I got when I was reading these stories was almost like I was getting some kind of sugar rush. That's the only way I can describe it, like a sugar rush. Similar to if I had eaten a giant chocolate cake slice. The reason I'm telling you guys this is that if you can crack that code, if you can get reluctant readers to read your stories, I believe that is the ultimate key to being successful in an episode. So, how do we create something that gives readers that sugar rush that I just described? How can we make our stories feel like you're eating a slice of chocolate cake? Well, there are a few things you can add in to do this. One is interesting choices, another is good directing, and another is good grammar. But I do believe these 3 things to be more like the icing on the cake, and don't really give you the main bulk of the experience. So I'm not going to focus on those today, we don't have time for that either, but what I'm instead going to focus on is the main bulk of that experience, which is the story itself. And also, it needs to be completely flavoured throughout with flavourful and good dialogue. Okay, so first of all, onto the story. How do we write a story that is satisfying to read from the moment we start it? Well, I'm going to give you an example of a story that I came up with the other day and see what you guys think of it. So this is you. You're a customizable MC. And in the beginning of the story, you meet a guy named Callum.
Sorry.
But here's the thing, he's really, really boring. So you actually stop dating Callum, and you end up dating this guy instead, Jamie. Okay, now, you date Jamie for a little bit, and then Callum comes back onto the scene and says, give me a second chance. So you decide to date both of them. Now you think Jamie's going to be mad at this, but it turns out that actually Jamie has someone on the side himself. A girl named Ellie. And you actually like Ellie a lot, and you actually get on with her, you become best friends. And you decide that it's probably best if Jamie and Ellie stick together and you and Callum stick together as exclusive. Now you and Callum decide to go on a holiday together, your first holiday together. You go off to Spain, and while you're there you meet a handsome waiter named Diego. Now Diego is everything you've ever dreamed of, so you dump Callum. And the very next week you and Diego get married. And you live happily ever after at the end. Really do not clap. Maybe not all of you, judging by your reactions, but I'm sure a lot of you will agree that this story is an absolute steaming pile of poop. It's terrible, it's really terrible, and the reason it's so terrible is because there's no structure to it. It is just a series of one event after the other. It doesn't really mean anything, and doesn't really go anywhere. So, how can we avoid this? How can we avoid writing a story that is just a series of events that don't really mean anything? Well, we can do this by using something that I like to call the 7 C's. Now, of course, I am not talking about that kind of 7 C's. What I'm talking about is the 7 letter C's. And those begin with something called catalyst. Now, catalyst will start up your story by igniting it, by having your character, your main character, be in a stable position of some kind, and then something comes along to change that and propel your protagonist into an uncomfortable situation where everything is chaos. So the next stage is a state of confusion. We don't know what's going on, we don't know how to adapt to our new situation, and everything is a disaster. But of course, we can't just have it all doom and gloom. We need to have a relative sense of calm after this, where our protagonist finds happiness again. And we definitely cannot stay in this lull for too long though, because it would get boring. So we need to really shake it up then, in the middle, with a massive bout of conflict. Usually this is a result of the first stable situation and the new stable situation clashing, usually. And then we need to find some kind of clarity after that, where our protagonist realises that where she wants to be in her life, whether that's in a romantic sense or like in a career sense or anything, and she needs to decide on how she's going to get to that point. And this is where we have the big climactic showdown, where we are going to achieve our goal, and finally the conclusion, where everything is wrapped up and our characters usually live happily ever after. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take those characters from my first example, and I'm going to apply the 7 C's to that story and hopefully make a better one. So instead of starting with our protagonist meeting Callum, she's actually already with Callum, and she has been with Callum since she was in high school. They're actually in a very stable relationship, and he's been sneaking around the last few weeks. And you think that he's been going out to do ring shopping because he's about to propose. But it turns out he was actually sneaking around having an affair with your best friend Sarah. So of course this is the catalyst which ignites the story, and Callum, you dump him because obviously he's a big douche. So Callum's out of the picture, but for the first time in your life, you're single, so this is where the confusion comes in. You've never dated before, you don't know how to date, you've never had to date. So you join a dating app and you go on dates with 3 different guys, and everything is a disaster. You don't know what you're doing, and your life is in complete chaos. So now we need to go into the calm. So how about we have Jamie, one of your dates. He actually found it quite endearing when you spilled your drink all over yourself in the restaurant. And it turns out that he has a similar past. His ex, Ellie, actually cheated on him. So you have that in common. And Ellie's also a douche. So you and Callum get together, and you're actually in a much better place than you ever were even with Callum. So, sorry, you and Jamie get together. You're in a better place than you were with Callum. A lot of names to remember. But of course we need to shake this up massively now so it doesn't get boring with some huge conflict. So of course let's bring Callum back into the picture. And he turns up and says he made a huge mistake. Please give me a second chance. I screwed up. And this aggravates Jamie, who says, do you still have feelings for Callum? And you say, well, I can't just shut those feelings off. I was with the guy since high school. This upsets Jamie. He says this isn't worth it, and the only guy to console you is Callum, who you end up getting back with. After a night of passion, but strictly off screen, remember the guidelines, guys. You wake up, and there's a message on his phone, and it turns out it is from Jamie's ex Ellie. It turns out the only thing that Callum has changed in his life is the girl that he's cheating on you with. It also turns out that it's quite a small world. So now we need clarity. Obviously Callum is never going to change. He was a douche and he always will be a douche. And you realise that you let the good guy go, you let Jamie go, and you need to go and get your man. So you race to his home address, bang on his door, but, and here we're going into the climactic showdown now, his neighbour tells you that he is right now in the church about to get married to Ellie. Yeah. So you burst on in there and you shout, yes, I have an objection. She's cheating on him with my ex-Callum. Of course, Ellie denies this, but then a guy in the crowd named Diego, he stands up and says, wait a minute, I thought I was the only guy you were having an affair with. It turns out Ellie has been sleeping with all but one of the groomsmen. Of course, Ellie screams that you've ruined everything, tries to slam your face into the wedding cake, but you dive out of the way, and she ends up just face planting herself. End of the climax. Okay, on to the conclusion. You stand at the altar with Jamie, and you say, would he be interested in giving this a second shot? And he says, yes, absolutely. Then we fade to 1 year later, and it is you in the wedding dress, and you and Jamie are getting married. The registrar says you may kiss the bride, and that is our happily ever after.
Yes.
Now I'm sure you guys will all agree that that is a much better structured story than the original example. So, on to dialogue. So, once we put all this hard work into constructing a great story, we need to make sure that the dialogue is not bland, which will ruin all of our hard work that we put into coming up with the plot. Now, dialogue usually provides just one purpose, which is to progress the plot. But if it only progresses the plot in a kind of informational way, it's going to be really, really boring and bland. So how can we add flavour to this dialogue? Well, what a lot of people do is they put in a load of banter. Now, this can work, but I do find that when it's just banter throughout the story, what happens is it becomes a little bit irritating for readers. So instead of banter, which we can use in certain degrees, I want to give you something else that you can add into your stories, which really, I think, will add a huge amount of flavour to it. And something which you might not be expecting, and that thing is anecdotes. So these are like snippets of a character's past, stories that these characters tell. Now, one mistake that a lot of writers make is they treat their characters as though they were born, or though their lives existed only from the point of chapter 1 of your story. Whereas a real person or a character that feels real will actually have an entire childhood to tell stories about. So, I'm going to give you some examples of how we could write dialogue for the story that I just outlined for you. Let's say in one scene we have you and Jamie on a date, and you would like to convey to him how much you love ice cream. So you could simply say, I love ice cream. I could eat ice cream all day long. I just love it so much. Now that conveys the information we want to convey. But of course, it's just pretty bland to read. So instead, how about we, using an anecdote, say, one time I ate 3 tubs of ice cream in one sitting. I could have carried on, but Sarah ripped the spoon out of my mouth. Instantly, that's just more interesting to read, and it makes us feel a little bit more connected to our protagonist. On to example 2. In this one, Jamie wants to open up about his vulnerabilities, and he wants to convey how he feels like there's just something missing in his life. He just says something plain and clear. I don't know what it is, but it just feels like there's something missing. Do you know what I mean? And you say, I think so. Again, this is obviously, it does convey that information, but it conveys it in a very plain way. So we can use an anecdote to really add flavour to this. So how about, when I was a kid, I had this favourite pair of shoes. I wore them every day without fail. Then we moved house, and somewhere along the line, one of them went missing. I never found that other shoe. And I know it sounds stupid, but ever since I felt like there's just something missing from my life. And that other shoe is symbolic of it. Pretty dumb, huh? And then you say, I actually don't think it's dumb at all. Okay, on to another example. So in this one, we have our characters start a chapter in a car you're driving. Now, one really cool thing that you can do is you don't have to reference events that happened in the blank space before your story existed. You can actually reference the blank space between chapters. So let's say that in the previous chapter to this one, something was happening, and then this starts like a couple of weeks later. So what we can do is reference what has happened in between with an anecdote. So here's the plain example. So this one actually does include some very light banter. I'm such a good driver, and Jamie says, I'm not so sure about that. Well, I think I am. And he says, oh, okay, whatever you say. So we can drastically improve this by saying, I'm such a good driver, and Jamie says, you knocked Mrs. Potts' gnome over as we pulled out of the drive. And you say, oh, come off, that was a one-off. And he says, it was the 3rd time this week. She's hot for your blood. So again, using an anecdote, that I just made that just less dry and boring. Now this is the last example before I finish this presentation and then open it for questions. So in the final scenes of this story, we could simply have our characters slow dancing on the dance floor at their wedding. And Jamie says to you, I love you. And you simply say, I love you too. The camera pans out, cue the credits. Now, this is a perfectly fine way to end the story, and this can work, but the problem is it's not very specific to any story. It could be the ending of any story, really. So we could improve this by, again, referencing the past. And a really, really cool thing about the final chapters of your story is now you don't even have to reference the blank space outside of the story, because you've gone on this journey all the way up until this point, and you have a real past with your readers, which is, that past is the earlier chapters. They've experienced it with you. So you can reference what you've already spoken about in the story itself. So instead of this, let's say we have it close up on them, and Jamie leans into you and he says, thank you. And you say, what for? And he just leans into you and whispers, for the other shoe. Thank you, guys.